A corpse can ferment before it dies. That's what the royal laundresses whispered behind closed doors, and in the final January nights of 1547, the King of England, Henry VIII of his name, lay not in regal repose, but in liquefaction. His legs ulcerated and split to the bone, seeped through linen and fur. The smell could not be masked, not even with cloves rosewater or crushed pearls burned in silver basins. In the stillness of the candlelit chamber at Whitehall, something living began to turn to soup. For Henry VIII, this was no sudden fall from grace. The collapse had been years in the making, a slow, treasonous rebellion waged by his own body. But now, stripped of the machinery of court life, stripped of the robes that had once made him seem imperial, the man lay exposed, not in front of Parliament or papal emissaries, but to his gurgling wounds, his haunted thoughts, and the men too afraid to meet his gaze. They called him a lion in winter, yet this lion had gnawed his own legs until only pus remained. His vast frame, nearly 400 pounds by modern estimate, was an ecosystem of wrought blood clots behind the knees, calcified deposits, along the spine blisters that hissed when pierced. His groin emitted a smell that caused visiting nobles to weep. And yet, in the corner of the room, the crown still sat atop red velvet untouched. If you enjoy immersive history, told with depth and detail, like this video and subscribe for more. The room was always dark, not for solemnity, but to conceal. Shadows did the work royal physicians could not. The ulcerations had breached into the bone, what surgeons now might call osteomyelitis, where infection metastasized like treason. The skin peeled like parchment soaked in oil. Cloth stuck to wounds and had to be cut away in strands. One foot was blackening. Two physicians privately debated amputation, but none dared bring a blade near the sovereign's sacred flesh. No courtiers sang madrigals now. No musicians plucked at lutes. The king's chamber, once the stage for feasts and processions, echoed only with wheezing and the wet gasp of decaying lungs. Attendants carried trays of silver and linens, but no one made eye contact. The silence was devotional, but not to majesty, only to horror. His bed had been modified, reinforced beneath with oak and iron. It creaked even when he breathed. As winter winds rattled the casements, the tapestries moved with phantom hands. The king stirred and muttered names no one wanted to hear. Anne. Thomas. More. His lips cracked and purple bled when he coughed. A fly landed there once. No one swatted it, and still he ruled. Between bouts of fever, he dictated minor orders to scribes who wept while they wrote. His signature, a jagged H, dragged like a drunkard's stagger, but it was enough to condemn. He signed one man's death warrant 3 days before his own. The ink blotted trembling. The man executed was never told the king was already dying. Behind the chamber walls, nobility paced like wolves counting down his final breaths. But no one dared announce what had already begun. To name death before it arrived was treason. To acknowledge decay was to admit weakness in the body politic. So they lied. The king is hale. The king is strong. The king is merely indisposed with a winter chill. Outside, London's frost-coated streets carried no sign of crisis. Chimneys smoked. Bells tolled for mass. The smell of roasted meats wafted from inns. But within Whitehall, behind velvet curtains and locked doors, the last Tudor titan was liquefying from the inside out. The symbolism was too potent to ignore. The king who had broken with Rome, dissolved monasteries, beheaded wives, and made himself a god, was now drowning in his own flesh. The empire he had built, brick by brutal brick, now trembled under the weight of religious fracture, economic ruin, and a hollow throne. His body was not merely dying. It was indicting everything he had touched. The ulcers were the prophecy. The pus foretold the future. His swollen legs, incapable of standing, mirrored a nation unsure where it stood between Catholic and Protestant, between old fealty and new defiance. His breath came in rattles. So did the realms, And still the pageantry endured. Peacocks roasted whole were served in distant banquets. Diplomats toasted to a king they hadn't seen in weeks. His painted portraits hung in every hall depicting a man 10 years younger, 40 pounds lighter, and unspeakably virile. But in the royal bed, Henry no longer resembled the god of those canvases. His eyes had receded into folds of jaundiced skin. The whites were yellow. His lips curled even in sleep, as if bracing against a blow. The silence of Whitehall became a tomb before his heart ever stopped. Candles burned through the night, not to illuminate, but to perfume. Priests waited outside the door, summoned, dismissed, then summoned again. And in the spaces between convulsions, the king would whisper prayers with no pattern, switching between Latin and English, invoking saints he had outlawed, and scriptures he had once burned. One night as the wind howled through a broken shutter, he gripped a servant's wrist and croaked a single word, "Mirror." No one knew what he meant, but the answer was everywhere. In the bowl of blood-stained water, in the soiled linens tossed beneath the bed, in the crown sitting unused, in the retching sounds of his attendants. Henry VIII, defender of the faith supreme head of the Church of England, had become a reflection of the empire he ruled, massive, diseased, hollowed from within. There would be no divine healing, no phoenix rising, only the slow, unspeakable humiliation of a man rotting faster than his realm. He had once been the envy of Europe. A Renaissance prince with a lion's mane of red gold hair, a chest that filled plate armor with ease, and calves so sculpted they were praised in diplomatic correspondence. Henry VIII had ridden stallions into battle, danced with ambassadors until the chandeliers shook and shattered lances in jousts that drew gasps from foreign courts. His youth was spectacle incarnate, a body fashioned for majesty. But all flesh has its rebellion. The cracks began early a jousting accident in 1536, when a charging knight's lance sent Henry toppling from his horse, the impact cracking his leg open and leaving him unconscious for hours. He survived, but his body never forgave him. What began as bruising became ulceration. The wound reopened, often refusing to heal breeding infection like a cursed spring. And yet he kept riding, kept eating, kept bedding wives and ordering banquets with enough roast venison to feed an army. Physicians cautioned him. He laughed. "I am England," he once declared to a physician who suggested leeches, "and England doesn't limp." But England did, and so did Henry. The infections deepened, drawing their roots through sinew and marrow. The King's Gait became a shuffle, then a limp, and finally a refusal to walk. His frame, once built for war and seduction, collapsed inward and outward at once. The legs swelled, the belly ballooned. Eyewitnesses began to describe him in terms used for livestock girth, lumber bulk. Some whispered he had become a human tomb. No more horse riding, no more dancing. By the 1540s, he was hoisted into reinforced chairs by ropes and pulleys. He groaned with every shift. His thighs chafed and bled where skin folded upon itself. His armor was quietly melted down, and his tailor began to design robes not for majesty, but for concealment. His enemies once feared his sword. Now they feared his scent. Foreign ambassadors noted it in their letters, a stench that clung to the velvet of his throne room that lingered in tapestries long after he'd gone. He was wrapped in layers of linen, soaked with myrrh, camphor, and resin, but nothing masked the truth. His body had turned from sanctuary to siege. Still the painters lied. Hans Holbein the Younger immortalized him in defiance, legs wide, arms akimbo, staring down the viewer as if daring them to blink. The image spread through England like a sigil of power, but Holbein painted from sketches, not from life. By the time the canvas was dry, the real Henry could no longer stand, let alone strike that pose. Behind locked doors, his body collapsed in on itself like a cathedral gutted by time. Those closest to him adopted a silent choreography to preserve the illusion servants carried incense cones in their sleeves. Physicians avoided mentioning weight. Secretaries removed mirrors. But some things could not be hidden. His hands trembled. Not from age, he was only 55, but from a circulatory system collapsing under the pressure of royal indulgence. His gums bled. His breath wheezed. His skin, once flushed with the pride of conquest, now bore the mottled hue of slow asphyxiation. They called it dropsy. They called it the king's leg. They called it divine punishment. What it was, what modern physicians might name it, was likely type 2 diabetes, complicated by gout and infected bone. But the court didn't care for medicine. They cared for obedience. Do not say the king is sick, a Lord Chancellor once warned. Say the king is healing in privacy. In private he screamed. The walls of Hampton Court had heard it. The oaken panels of Whitehall groaned with it. At night, when the attendants dared remove the wrappings, he howled as if his soul was being peeled away. Boiled onions, vinegar poultices, and crushed sapphire were applied to his open wounds in desperate acts of alchemy. The pain made him violent. A physician was once struck with a fire iron and left with a shattered jaw. The king wept afterward, but the man was paid to keep silent. Henry's appetite never left him. Even as digestion failed, he demanded roast swan pies laced with cloves gallons of hippocras. He ate not to nourish, but to defy. The more his body betrayed him, the more he fed it as if he could smother death under meat and sugar. There was a moment in his final year, witnessed by a trusted page, when the king, struggling to rise from a lavatory chair, stared at his own leg for several minutes. "Is that mine?" he whispered. "Is that still me?" No one answered, because the answer was, no, not anymore. What had once been Henry VIII was now a grotesque parody of royalty. The throne could barely hold him. His coronation robes had been recut twice. Servants moved in rotating shifts to clean him, using vinegar-soaked cloths and silver tools. The ulcers, when visible, wept fluid the color of old wine. His pulse was irregular. His pupils dilated at random. But still he signed laws. Still he declared war. Still he summoned nobles to kneel and kiss the ring. A body may rebel, but power doesn't abdicate. What made Henry's decline so terrible was not its swiftness, but its duration. He did not fall like a tyrant in a play. He rotted. Over years, in public and in secret, like a nation aging beyond its gods. One bishop, after visiting the king, reportedly vomited upon leaving the chamber. He later wrote, "The scent of mortal decay was mingled with frankincense and pride." He meant it as a condemnation of Henry's stubbornness. But it was more than that. It was prophecy. The king was no longer man nor myth. He was warning. They came at night, those phantoms in silk and shadow, not through doors, but through memory, not in flesh, but in breath that chilled the already freezing chamber air. Henry VIII, once the scourge of heretics and traitors, now lay beneath embroidered drapes, trembling not from cold, but from what he believed moved in the silence between candle flickers. He began to speak to people no one else could see. The chamberlain recorded at first a midnight murmur from behind the heavy curtain of the royal bed. Then a scream, raw and sudden. When attendants rushed in, the king sat bolt upright, eyes wide with terror, pointing to the foot of his bed. "She was here," he rasped, spit pooling in the corners of his lips. Anne. Watching. They dismissed it as fever, opium, residual guilt. But by the third night, it was no longer just Anne Boleyn. They heard him plead with Thomas More, curse Thomas Cromwell, mutter about Catherine Howard. "She practiced her death, you know. Practiced it." He cried once, repeating her name, as if confessing something no priest had ever demanded. Too young. Too... But the thought trailed off into wheezing and silence. The ghosts were always at the edge of vision. Women in white, men in chains, a bishop with no eyes. Sometimes he wept after seeing them. Sometimes he laughed. He ordered extra guards posted outside the chamber, not to protect his dying body, but to keep something from getting in or from getting out. The guards obeyed. They carried halberds tipped with silver. They whispered prayers. One swore he heard footsteps pacing behind the door when the king was unconscious, and no one else was inside. Inside, Henry spoke of judgment, not God's, theirs, the judgment of those he had condemned. He described them standing in a line at the edge of the room, silent with their hands bound or heads bowed. He once asked his chaplain, "If the King of England confesses to a ghost, is the sin absolved?" The chaplain said yes. Henry said nothing for 2 days. His dreams grew worse. In sleep he thrashed and mumbled Latin fragments. He called out for his mother, Elizabeth of York. Once he shrieked so violently that servants had to be summoned from their quarters to restrain him. His limbs, heavy as timber, moved with surprising force when panic gripped him. Afterward, he moaned like a child. "She was at the window," he whispered. "My Elizabeth." Her face was bleeding. It was then that they removed the mirrors. All of them. One had cracked in the night without being touched, the servant swore. Another, positioned by the hearth, reflected not the room, but a woman in shadow, even when no one stood there. The king forbade their return. "I know what I look like," he muttered, "and who looks back?" As his body deteriorated, so did his grasp on reality. His counsel blamed medication, opium, laudanum, belladonna, but the madness seemed to arrive even in sober hours. He became suspicious of those who lingered too long in the chamber, accusing one attendant of conspiring to steal his breath. "They want my death to happen faster," he hissed, spittle tracing the edge of his lip. "But it is mine. I will decide when." There was a window in the chamber, heavy with frost, its panes bowed outward from the cold. Each morning the king asked if the snow had covered the palace yet. He feared being buried alive. "Promise me I will not be shut in a box while I still breathe," he commanded Cranmer, gripping the archbishop's sleeve so tightly the man's hand went numb. Cranmer nodded solemnly and ordered extra checks for signs of death. It was not ceremony. It was precaution. On a bitter morning in mid-January, Henry addressed a figure no one else could see. He spoke for a long time, softly, intimately. When an attendant approached, he turned and snarled, "Do not interrupt my wife." No one dared ask which one. Later that evening, the king demanded to be left alone with a locked coffer beside his bed. When his attendants returned at dawn, he had opened it and strewn its contents across the sheets, a miniature portrait of Jane Seymour, a child's prayer book with a broken clasp and a lock of blonde hair bound in faded blue ribbon. The king had not spoken, only wept. This was not piety. It was unraveling. The court grew uneasy. Rumors bled beyond the palace walls, that the king raved in tongues, that he summoned the dead, that his soul was trying to climb out of his mouth before the body was ready. One nun claimed to have seen a black dog enter the palace, grounds then vanish at the chapel door, a sign, she whispered, that death had come, but not yet collected. The physicians were helpless. There was no medicine for fear, no tincture for regret. They tried to distract him, read him passages of scripture, sang soft psalms, even brought a lute player to perform outside his door. But the music only made the king weep harder. "And sang like that," he said before I, and then he swallowed the words. There were days when the king fell into near silence, gazing at the ceiling as though reading from it, lips moving, hands twitching. And in those moments, something in the room changed. The air thickened. Candles flickered without breeze. One servant swore that when Henry slept, his shadow remained awake, still moving. The King of England, once feared across Europe, now feared the space under his bed. When Archbishop Cranmer came again to offer comfort, he found Henry muttering over and over, "Do not let them take me. Not yet. not all of them. The archbishop laid a hand on his chest and whispered, "Only one thing can take you now, my liege." But Henry knew better. Death was coming, yes, but so were they. Power does not wait for death. It lurks in the hallway, just outside the sick room, where breath slows and decisions ferment. In the final weeks of Henry VIII's life, the most dangerous place in England was not the battlefield or the tower. It was the corridor between his chamber door and the council chamber beyond it. Henry's body lay still, but the realm vibrated with movement. His groans were muffled behind velvet curtains, but the scratching of pens, the shuffling of boots, the murmured oaths of men with titles and ambitions, they filled every space of Whitehall. He had given England a son, but not a king. Edward was only 9, fragile, pale, and quiet. And children do not rule kingdoms. Men do. Men with bloodied hands, locked jaws, and ink-stained fingers ready to reshape the realm in their image. And Henry, so obsessed with order, had left behind a plan. A regency council of 16 noblemen chosen to govern jointly. Balanced, he thought. Self-correcting. Safe. But no plan survives the scent of blood. At the center of it all stood Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle. Tall, shrewd, and cold as marble, he had learned well from watching Henry destroy rivals. Where others hesitated, Seymour moved. Quiet meetings were held beneath the guise of prayer. Guards were reassigned. Loyal clerks were given new titles. And one by one, those meant to share power with him found their authority chipped away before the king had even drawn his final breath. The Duke of Norfolk, once untouchable, was arrested on charges of treason. His son, the Earl of Surrey, already executed weeks earlier. It was Henry's signature on the death warrant. His hand-shaking ink pooled into a black blot where his name should have ended. But the command stood. Norfolk would have followed had the king not died first. The irony hung heavy, a dying monarch executing another to preserve a world already dissolving. Inside the bedchamber, Henry lay swaddled in furs, dreaming of ghosts. Outside, England rearranged itself. Courtiers formed new orbits, gravitating toward Seymour's gravity. Bishops repositioned sermons. Foreign ambassadors drafted coded letters to their courts. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis noted the smell of change even more pungent than the stench of the royal ulcers. "England is already mourning," he wrote, "but not for the reasons they admit." The silence surrounding the king's condition was total. Physicians were gagged with oaths, chambermaids forbidden to speak to even their husbands. Those who entered the sick room emerged, pale eyes averted. And behind that veil of secrecy, power surged like rot beneath flesh. The rituals of monarchy continued, but empty. Councils convened, but no decrees were issued. Letters arrived, but went unanswered. The throne, though not vacant, was already hollow. The realm waited on a heartbeat. In the kitchens, food was still prepared, as though Henry might dine that evening: venison pasties, mulled hippocras, buttered pears. But the dishes remained untouched, covered cooling. When servants lifted the lids, the meats steamed like corpses exhumed. Catherine Parr, his 6th and surviving wife, paced the galleries like a ghost of the living. Her place was precarious. She had tended to the king with real care, read scriptures aloud, softened his temper, stroked his bloated hands. But she was not Edward's mother. And when kings die, even queens become liabilities. She asked to see him near the end. She was denied. Instead, it was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who stayed closest. His loyalty was not to the crown's warmth, but to its structure. He knew what would follow. If the king died unshriven, the factions would weaponize his soul. Protestants would claim conversion. Catholics would claim damnation. The nation's theology would hang on a dying man's final breath. Cranmer stood watch, waited, whispered prayers, but he too had eyes on the succession. The prince had already been moved to Windsor for safety. The move was more than protection, it was strategy. Edward would not see his father die. He would arrive to the crown, not the corpse. Seymour ensured it. He had the boy surrounded by loyal guards, Protestant tutors, and sympathetic nurses. By the time London heard the bells toll, the child king would already be sewn into the new regime. Meanwhile, Henry lingered, his breath wet and shallow, his eyes open but unfocused. Sometimes he seemed to register the faces around him. Other times he stared through them as if trying to recognize someone long gone. Servants recorded instances where he spoke to no one, arguing legal clauses about inheritance or muttering about Elizabeth's legitimacy. One night he awoke screaming, convinced his will had been altered in the night. It hadn't. Not yet. But men were preparing to do so. A revised version was drafted in secret, omitting inconvenient clauses and emphasizing Seymour's authority. It bore the same seal. No one would dare question it if the king died before it was discovered. Such was the calculus of power. The realm Henry had forged through violence, seduction, and scripture was now being carved up in whispers, while his heart still beat. In a nation where the monarch had once ruled with terrifying immediacy, executing wives before breakfast, now even his death would be delayed for convenience. For 3 days after his passing, the kingdom would pretend he still lived. Because power cannot be allowed to die in public. Because England, like its king, had begun to rot long before the last breath escaped. The king was dead, but no one was allowed to say it. January 28, 1547, passed in whispers and silence. The Privy Council sealed the bedchamber. The doors were closed, not with mourning, but with strategy. Outside, trumpets did not sound. No black cloth draped the palace gates. No bells tolled. The heart of the English throne had stopped. Yet the machinery of rule continued its quiet, desperate hum, as though to delay the body's decay, by denying it breathless. Inside the chamber, Henry's corpse lay monstrous. Death had unfastened him from dignity. His jaw hung open, lips peeling back to reveal grayed teeth stained with wine and blood. The royal bed beneath him, massive oak-framed, gilded, now served as an altar of human ruin. Beneath the furs, the stench was unbearable. When the attendants lifted the layers to confirm what they already feared, several turned away and vomited. One fainted. Another muttered a prayer to Saint Sebastian, long outlawed by the king himself. They bathed his corpse in wine, poured rose oil across his chest, packed his ruptured leg ulcers with cloth soaked in alum and camphor. Still it seeped. The body had begun to swell by the hour. His bloated abdomen rose like a blister beneath the linen. His eyes would not close. Thomas Cranmer was summoned. He had not yet been told the king had died, only that the moment was near. He arrived with ritual, expecting final prayers, final breath. But by the time he stood beside the bed, Henry's skin had gone pale and papery. He could not speak. His mouth had dried into a stretched circle, a silent trumpet of death. "Your Majesty," Cranmer whispered, "if you die in Christ, squeeze my hand." Some claim the king did. Others say it was merely a spasm, the last echo of a nervous system that had ruled England longer than most men lived. Either way, the room held its breath, then a nod, and then urgency. The corpse was not just flesh, it was evidence, proof that power had passed. If the public saw it too soon, factions would rise. Enemies would strike, foreign ambassadors would pounce like wolves upon a bleeding stag. So the council made a decision: he would not die until they were ready. The door was locked, the news sealed. 3 full days would pass before England learned its king was gone. In those 3 days, the palace became a sanctum of theater. Fake meals were sent to his chamber and left untouched. Couriers were told the king was unwell, but improving. Ministers wore faces of cautious optimism. And Seymour, already shifting into his new title, moved faster than the smell of death itself. Fortress keys changed hands. Royal seals were redistributed. Orders were signed in the king's name by men who already knew he was gone. The Queen was not informed. Catherine Parr paced her apartments awaiting word, waiting for permission to approach. She had been barred from the chamber in his final week under the pretense of needing rest herself. Some suspected Seymour orchestrated it, fearing she might interfere with the Regency's careful design. When the truth reached her days later, she reportedly said nothing for a long time, only wept, then dressed in black without waiting for ceremony. Meanwhile, the embalmers were summoned. It was too late. The rot had advanced beyond their skill. When they opened the king's abdomen to remove his organs, the scent reportedly forced one man to collapse on the spot. The liver had blackened. The intestines were bloated, stained with blood and fluid. His heart, once so famously large, it was claimed metaphorically had swollen to grotesque proportions, heavy with coagulated matter. Some thought it might burst before they could seal the cavity. They stuffed the corpse with herbs, lavender sage, marjoram. Packed him with cloth, soaked in vinegar. Still the gases swelled. They sewed him shut and wiped the skin clean. Then wrapped him in bandages sealed in waxed cloth and encased in a lead-lined coffin made to measure not once but twice, as the first was too narrow. Even in death, the king's presence distorted everything around him. And yet, outside, the chamber, calm. Court painters were instructed to prepare effigies, not of the man who died, but the one who lived in myth, strong-legged crimson-robed fists on hips. Holbein's Henry. A lie repeated with enough paint to convince a nation. One courtier wrote His Majesty now sleeps peacefully, having departed this world, surrounded by majesty and prayer. The truth, he had died, screaming filthy and alone. The guards who had stood outside the door for days reported strange sounds, not the movement of servants, something heavier, like groaning timbers, like breath from a mouth that no longer drew air. Superstition took root. One guard refused to continue the watch. Another swore the king's dog, once dismissed from court for snarling at a bishop, howled all night beneath the bedchamber window. And beneath all of it, the question beat like a second heart. What happens now? The answer lay not in ceremony, but in logistics. Henry's body could not remain above ground for long. So they began the slow theatrical process of moving the dead king toward burial. It would take weeks to orchestrate. Each step masked the urgency, each gesture wrapped in grandeur, and yet every moment was an effort to keep his ruin from staining the illusion of order. Because England could not know how its king had died. It could not know that the man who had made himself head of its church, its courts, its fate, had been reduced to a leaking bag of meat, sealed in scented lead. So they held the kingdom together with perfume and pretense. And the lie held for a time. The coffin cracked before it reached the chapel. It had been fashioned of oak and lined with lead, reinforced to contain not just a corpse, but a warning. No ordinary casket could hold the monstrous weight Henry had become. Some said nearly 400 pounds, a mass of royal flesh bloated by sugar wine and slow ruin. But no carpenter dared say so aloud. They measured him in reverence, not inches. The first coffin failed. The second groaned with strain. Still they sealed it, poured molten wax around the joints, then wrapped it in velvet bearing the Tudor rose. It was not enough. As the lead-lined box lay in state at Whitehall surrounded by tapers and black-draped standards, the gases inside swelled. The skin beneath split. Fluids pooled. The smell already foul-turned animal. One servant later whispered that the chapel air tasted of meat. The corpse had become a slow explosion, compressed death, pressing against its cage. Then it happened. The bottom of the coffin split. Not fully. Just enough. Just a weeping crack at first, but enough to spill a black fluid across the chapel floor. It trickled down the stone, then puddled, then leaked beneath the altar steps. Dogs, stray or summoned by scent, lapped at it before attendants could intervene. No one screamed. No one gasped. They had rehearsed for everything, except this: the floor was scrubbed, the dog was kicked, a new cloth was placed beneath the coffin. The story was rewritten before it was spoken. A holy leak, one bishop muttered. A final anointing. But those who saw it could not forget. Majesty did not bleed. It should not rot. It should not smell like this. Yet still the show marched on. The funeral procession, an opera of velvet iron and pageantry, was England's most elaborate act of denial. It departed Whitehall in silence, drawn by teams of black-draped horses. Over the coffin lay an effigy sculpted in wax Henry, as he wished to be remembered, broad-chested, ageless, unmoved by death. Its painted eyes stared skyward. Its lips were sealed with beeswax. None would see the ruin beneath. As the cortege passed, crowds knelt, wept, crossed themselves. They saw not a body collapsing from within, but a myth on wheels. Trumpets sounded. Psalms were sung. In front of the carriage, heralds bore the sword scepter and orb symbols of a power no longer attached to breath. Behind the pageantry, men in black whispered logistics: how to replace the cracked boards, how to prevent another spill, whether to bury quickly or risk further spectacle. They agreed Windsor. Immediately. No delay. The king's final destination was St. George's Chapel. The journey took days. Cold slowed the decay, but not enough. The coffin rode beneath layers of cedar branches, herbs, and snow-soaked cloth. Attendants carried vinegar-soaked sponges in their sleeves. One fainted before they reached the Thames. Upon arrival at Windsor, the coffin was lowered carefully, reverently, and with several audible creaks, into the vault beside Jane Seymour, the one wife who had given him a son, and died before falling from favor. She had become his sanctified exception, his ideal in death. It was fitting then that she received him not as a husband, but as a neighbor in rot. The vault closed. The final words were said, but the body didn't stop speaking. Years later, during renovations to the chapel floor, the tomb was opened. Workers reported a stench still trapped in stone. The coffin had buckled inward. The corpse inside had collapsed into itself, compressed by centuries, leaving little more than a massive skeleton and a rancid smear where the king had once been. The bones bore marks of arthritis, calcium growths, and deep erosion in the legs, proof of the agony contemporaries had only whispered. No monuments had been built above. The elaborate tomb Henry had envisioned columns of brass 40 life-sized effigies, a gold statue of himself atop a horse, was never completed. The funds had vanished. The bronze melted down during the English Civil War. The crown's memory grew poor where its body once overflowed. Instead, his grave lay beneath a worn stone slab. A king who had reigned with thunder, remembered by a floor tile. But his image survived elsewhere. Holbein's portrait still hung in royal halls, searing into every observer the fiction of control. Henry with feet-wide fists, clenched eyes, locked forward, immortal. In schools and churches, in the minds of a people, this was Henry, defiant, undiminished. Not the man whose coffin split from pressure. Not the man whose servants gagged. Not the king whose dogs licked the last of him off a chapel floor. And yet that was the truth. His corpse had refused to lie quietly. It had spoken, oozed, rejected containment, a final rebellion against the theater of monarchy. It had revealed through blood and bile the central lie of kingship that power can be embalmed. That image can survive flesh. That majesty is more than a costume wrapped around decay. And so Henry's body, even in death, defied his own design. A corpse fit for no crown. History is not made by truth. It is cast in bronze, lacquered in oil, and whispered by survivors. In the weeks following Henry VIII's burial, England did not mourn a man, it embalmed a myth. The myth of strength, the myth of order, the myth of control, that the king had died with dignity, that his rule had been righteous, that his breath had ceased like a flame, gently extinguished, not like a furnace flooding itself with smoke and blood. The courtiers knew better. The servants who had bathed his corpse, those who had changed his blood-soaked linens, those who had sealed his bloated chest with wax, they knew. But they were paid, threatened, promoted, or dismissed. Some were sent away with pensions, others with silence. The Tower welcomed two who spoke too freely. The rest learned it is safer to polish the crown than to describe the wound beneath it. And so, the image-making began. Artists were summoned not to render the body as it was, but to preserve the fiction. The official mourning portrait showed Henry radiant, even in death eyes closed in repose, face serene hands folded over a jeweled cross. It was a face only faintly resembling the man who had died, shrieking into opium-soaked pillows. The court had decided he would not be remembered by the smell of his wounds or the tremble of his final prayer, but by the luster of his symbols. The crown, the orb, the sword of state, all laid gently beside the wax effigy. The true relics, the blood-stiffened bandages, the scorched sheets, the ruptured coffin boards were destroyed or hidden. Some say a lock of his final hair, brittle and gray, was kept in a wooden box by Cranmer himself. Others speak of a linen scrap, stained black, tucked into a servant's sleeve, and buried quietly beneath a chapel stone. But such stories are whispers, and whispers do not become textbooks. The children were not told everything. Young Edward VI, now king at 9, was taught of his father's majestic passing. The boy wrote in his journal, "My father is dead. The realm now looks to me, a child's detachment or perhaps early training in statecraft. He never asked to see the body. He never returned to Whitehall's royal bedchamber. The bed was dismantled within the year. The tapestries burned. Mary and Elizabeth processed the loss differently. Mary, devout and resentful, saw divine justice. God hath judged him. She reportedly told a Spanish envoy, though the words may be apocryphal." Elizabeth remained silent. Observers noted her expression at court, still cold, unreadable. She would not speak of her father publicly for nearly a decade. Her silence became its own monument. But not all silence is forgetfulness. The memory of Henry's reign lingered in corners, the place on the stone floor where the coffin leaked, the echo in the halls where his screams once rang out, the bitter musk that no incense could ever quite remove. Servants spoke of cold spots, strange creaks, a door that opened on its own, despite being barred. And then, there were the records. Cranmer ensured that the physician's notes were preserved, though not distributed. A full accounting of treatments, the opiates, the herbal compresses, the lancing of ulcers, the failed leeching, the bloodletting that had been abandoned in the final week when the king's veins no longer bled. The journals detailed without embellishment the collapse of a man from within. They spoke of screaming, of hallucinations, of the brown-green discharge that soaked his bedclothes nightly. These records were not taught, they were archived. Meanwhile, the public story hardened. A magnificent ruler, defender of England, father of the Church, his wives, tragic necessities, his executions, just reprisals, his body honored in full, his soul at peace. The memory was molded, a memory forged in bronze. In 1552, 5 years after his death, a statue was commissioned to be placed outside a newly completed court building. It showed Henry standing tall, hand on hilt beard, trimmed sharp eyes narrowed in eternal command. Beneath his feet, a Latin inscription. He brought order where chaos reigned. No mention of what rotted beneath his robes, no mention of the cracked coffin. Even the funeral's grotesque detail, the fluid seepage, the dogs, the servants' retching was revised in later chronicles as a fabrication by Catholic enemies. Tudor apologists labeled it slander. Court historians carefully omitted the physical descriptions and focused instead on his legislative accomplishments, his naval expansions, his theological reforms. Over time, the myth overtook the man. Children were taught to honor the image. Playwrights invoked his name as shorthand for majesty. Painters continued to copy Holbein's pose. Every monarch who followed would be compared to him, judged by his decisive cruelty, his autocratic presence, his myth of unshakable rule. No ruler after him would so fully embody the throne. None would dare try. And so the physical truth was buried beneath incense, beneath stone, beneath official record. But it was not erased. The servants who had seen his last days never forgot. Some refused to work in Whitehall again. Others drank themselves into silence. A few emigrated, settling in distant counties where their grandchildren told stories of a king who roared in his deathbed dreams and bled into the floor. One midwife, long retired, told her parish priest a crown does not stop the flesh from splitting. She was not believed. Yet somewhere beneath the slabs of St. George's Chapel, in a box warped by time, that flesh still waits. And though the court may have sealed it with velvet and prayer, history, real history, remembers the leak. He had ruled as if time were his subject. Laws bent around his will. Clergy crumbled beneath his breath. Men who defied him vanished from records, from portraits, from memory. He had torn England from Rome, not with theological conviction, but with hunger for control, for legacy, for a son. And for decades the realm obeyed. But in the final hour's time, no longer bowed. It loomed. On the night before his death, Henry VIII lay drowning in his own weight. The bed creaked beneath his breath. He could no longer speak. His mouth, once capable of condemning a nobleman to death with a whisper, hung slack and cracked. His eyes fluttered, not with sleep, but with the terror of someone staring into a mirror too long and finally seeing through it. He reached for someone. No one came. They had left him not out of disrespect, but design. The final hours were too dangerous. The king's face was now a liability, his breath a secret. His weakness, if seen, could unravel the scaffolding of power Seymour had so carefully constructed. Better to let him die in solitude than let anyone witness the truth, that power ends in silence. A boy king had already been dressed, orders had been drafted, the bells had already been polished, and so England waited not to mourn, but to transition. But within the locked chamber, the truth was unspeakable. The man who had executed wives with theatrical elegance, who had scripted the deaths of advisers and courtiers like a playwright, crafting blood, now whispered nothing. His final moments were not grand. There was no flash of defiance, no final sermon, no last command, only stillness, only rot. Archbishop Cranmer, summoned in haste, arrived too late to hear a confession. He took the king's hand, found it cold, and muttered the words anyway. He asked for a sign, a squeeze, a flicker of faith. And perhaps, just perhaps, it came. Or perhaps the body twitched in death as it had in life, not from belief, but from pain. What remained of Henry VIII was sealed beneath the floor. No statues of gold, no monumental tomb, just stone, just a name. The king who had spent his life reshaping England to reflect himself now lay mute beneath a chapel where his children would pray to different gods in different tongues under different regimes. His empire, already fraying, began to pull apart within days. Edward Seymour, his brother-in-law, the man who had orchestrated the veil over his death, took control with the title of Lord Protector. Parliament was reshaped, clergy realigned. The boy king was moved like a chess piece. The great king's plans for balance and unity lasted less than a week. Mary, his Catholic daughter, watched as Protestant reforms surged forward. Elizabeth, illegitimate in name but royal in blood, began her long performance of political survival. And in every corner of the kingdom, the tension that Henry's iron hand had held in check, religious war class, unrest, foreign suspicion, began to thrum louder. His body had finally stopped decaying. His country had just begun. Foreign courts sent condolences laced with strategy. France feigned mourning. The Empire weighed opportunity. The Pope who had once damned him as a heretic offered a mass in ironic charity. But none of them grieved the man. They grieved the moment, the death of a fixed point around which they had all revolved. The sun had gone out, and no one yet knew what the new constellation would look like. Even his symbols betrayed him. The crown that had once sat upon his head with such gravity now rested atop a wax child. The sword of state, once his instrument of justice and fear, lay untouched. His seal was melted. His likeness began to change. The young king's portrait mimicked his father's posture, but his eyes were too wide, too gentle, too breakable. And then there was the bed. The bed where Henry died was dismantled within a year. Some said it groaned at night. Others claimed it would not burn when thrown into the hearth. Superstition, or truth clinging to wood grain. But it was not the bed that mattered. It was the story. And stories once released do not remain whole. In Protestant pulpits, Henry's deathbed squeeze became a miracle, a king who saw the true faith in his final hour. In Catholic rumor, he died raving and cursed, surrounded by the ghosts of martyrs he had created. In popular tales, he was regal to the end crowned, even in his final breath. They were all lies, and they were all necessary, because the truth that power does not insulate that terror finds even the thickest velvet, that legacy cannot prevent the body from collapsing into filth, is too much for a nation to carry forward. But perhaps it is also the most human thing he ever did. In dying poorly, Henry VIII joined the rest of us, not as a monarch, not as a god, but as a body, a breath, a silence. And in that silence lies a truth his reign could never kill. All power crumbles at the edge of the grave,